So here we are now in Chapter 5, Anticipations, Part 2. So I'm building on the first video on Chapter 5 of Anticipations. Go back and check that out. And I'm still, of course, in this book, and still Part 2, The Theory of Aggression. And what we're looking at now is, we talked about preemptive, preventative wars, and how do we unpack all this? And we came down to talking about it seems to be some kind of examination of what the enemy is doing. We eliminated the simple equivalency of, a shift in power. Oh, that's a hostile intention or evidence of a hostile intention or a hostile act. And then you got to counter that. We showed that where we made the case. Walzer makes the case that that it's a little bit paranoid, and it's not necessary to assume negative intentions by your opponents, and also that the whole notion of the balance of power can lead to basically a kind of an anarchy, like a real anarchy where everything goes out of whack and a hegemon emerges, or it's just all out warfare. Okay, so what's the main point here? Well, that simply a simple fear is not enough to justify or even talk about justifying a preventative strike or a preemptive strike, right? Why? Let's unpack this. So we need something called a just fear, not simply fear. So what is a just fear? Well, let's start that X can legitimately claim a just fear of Y, provided that X is certain of Y's hostile intentions. And so we divorced the concept of hostile intention from being simply operationalized in terms of augmentation of power, right? I see the power building up over there. I cannot immediately infer that the buildup of power is evidence of a hostile intention. It might be, but it's not automatic, right? So we're turning that into an invalid inference. You need something extra to support it. It might turn out that indeed this increase of power by a neighboring state is evidence of a hostile intention, but on its own, you can't just immediately infer that it is such evidence. So if you think about this, the just fear is when you can be certain of the hostile intentions. So at the heart of the notion of just fear is this notion of hostile intention. So we have to unpack these hostile intentions, and we will unpack them in terms of willful hostile acts. And what are willful hostile acts? Well, those would be the actions that Y does. Okay, so X is worried about Y. So acts that Y does and they harm X. So we're going to look at things that are actually harmful, right? Rather than just simply this very abstract increase of power, infer hostile intentions. No, we're going to be looking at actions that are harmful, and also not just any action that's harmful, but we're looking, though, at least at the start, that actions that are harmful might be the basis of a just fear. Okay, so let's continue. Now, it might very well be the case that Y has no intention of attacking X, but we could have something like follows. The actions that Y does and harm X, they might be actions Q that are nonviolent, right? So here's the thing, is that you might be able to get an argument off the ground that says you can respond to nonviolence with violence. Let's see. Y is committing acts, we'll call them Q. They are nonviolent, and they are acts that will pressure and change X. Y knows, this is all deliberate, Y knows that these acts Q will bring about a desired effect, namely the changing of X in a way such that X weakens and collapses, right? Lots of times countries and states will do this. They will employ nonviolent means which will degrade the forces of a neighboring state. Constantly building up power on the edges of states to force the other state to scramble its jets and activate its forces. Thereby, the state that is constantly having to scramble its forces will be depleting their resources, draining. It's essentially trying to, you could think of trying to bankrupt another state, right? So states will try and do that, and then they'll say, hey, we have no intention of attacking. That may very well be true. No, we don't need, why? Because we don't need to attack. I could I could use if I had larger an economic power and all that, I could use that to literally bully another state into bankruptcy. Okay, and I can then say, hey, I have no intention of attacking because I knew I didn't have to. So I could get around that by doing these kinds of acts. Q, they're nonviolent, and I'm going to bankrupt the state next to me anyways. So I don't have to, I don't have to risk my military and my soldiers getting killed over it. I can just bankrupt the other side. So why is doing all this? And let's say we build in a couple presuppositions because we're trying to get this argument off the ground as a just fear, which could lead to a preemptive or preventative war by X in kind of defense, self-defense as a preemptive or a preventative attack. Well, if we presuppose that X, let's say, to keep with my imagery of sort of the larger state, kind of bullying a smaller state, X has no nonviolent way to respond to stop Q. So maybe X says to Q, "Hey, stop doing what you're doing because you're degrading my military, you're degrading all my economic resources by forcing me to activate and respond. Please stop doing that." Well, if that doesn't work, maybe state X has no alternative except to face the choice of degradation of resources and collapse, or do something about it, but you have no nonviolent way. And maybe your only option is something that you do possess. X has the force capacity to counter Q. Maybe can't take over the Y or whatever, but at least can do something about it. Well, then the result is these actions Q, they're nonviolent, but these are willful hostile acts. They're willful hostile acts that unpacks at the heart of just fear. Willful hostile acts are really evidence of the hostile intentions, and so X can legitimately claim a just fear of Y, right? Why? Because I have given an interpretation of all the actions of Y that eventually is going to lead to the degradation of my state's integrity and its collapse. And ultimately, no state has the obligation to let itself collapse. This is Walzer's argument. But that's going to get a little trickier when you look at certain kinds of states, maybe brutal dictatorships or something. But in this abstract form, Walzer says that in that case, the result is that X has the right to attack Y, at least in order to try and stop Q. So preventative or preemptive and preventative wars can legitimately be launched. So that is part of the modification. I don't think it's a big modification. It's a small modification of that legalist paradigm that Walzer talked about in chapter 4, the number 3, the third proposition, because he was talking about sort of imminent threats or whatever, or threats that can be diagnosed as the threat is unpacked in terms of these willful hostile acts, which is the grounding of a just fear. And then if you couple it with this with this force capacity and the absence of a nonviolent way, then the result is that yes, X has the right to attack Y in order to stop Q. And this is sort of the small kind of modification that yes, you can find situations, and Walzer again looks at what he thinks is an application of this. And actually he derives it, really, he thinks, from history. And you can have a look at the wars that he looks at that says, yeah, in some cases it's possible to justify a preemptive attack. So we have our first modification. More modifications are going to come, but that will be in later chapters. Stay tuned for those.